something that's an older topic, but more recently gaining traction again, and that's a use of sales tax around services. And we have information on our two panel members in your program, but I want to give an introduction from SUAA to the two individuals who are going to be speaking with us. Elizabeth Ginsberg, the two E's, E and E, is with the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. And you can see her background in that material. Alaine Gabarik is from the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, has been working on sales tax research. There's been recent work that's gone out in terms of a report on this, looking at the ability of a tax on services, particularly to expand a revenue base that we could use in Illinois to support the many functions of state government, including ensuring our pensions are strong and retiree health care is taken care of. So I'm going to ask a few opening questions for each of them, but without too much ado, we want to then open it up to the floor. It's a topic that tends to generate quite a bit of interest, opinions about what we should do or not do, and plenty of folks in here I know who have those opinions, so we want to make sure we get time to do that. So I'm going to let them tag team. Let's start with maybe why this has come to the fore again. Again, as Kent and I were talking a bunch, we've seen these discussions ebb and flow over the years about a tax on services to expand the revenue base. Obviously, it's back at the fore once more. Whoever wants to grab it, why now? What's prompted this latest round of thinking about what we might be able to do to expand the tax base through services? Alaine, you going to take it?
I will take
it. All right.
So I think that's a great question to kick this off. So as probably many of you know, as the last legislative session this has been a pretty tough budget year for the state. So this isn't the first year that this has come up. For the past several years now, the state has what is known as a structural deficit, which means that our revenues are not rising at the same rate as our costs are rising. So as, years go, we don't, fix this problem, we're going to keep running into not having enough revenue to cover the costs of our really critical core services like K-12 education, higher education, healthcare, pensions, etc. So I think that, this is something that has come up in the past. In 2019, I believe, when, again, we were just running into the structural deficit issues at the state level. So this is something that the state has to do, I think, eventually, and sooner will be, better than later as, we go forward in this state deficit.
So in terms of maybe two or three big ideas about how this might be approached, if we would move toward some services, maybe Elizabeth talk a bit about that, and Alaine will weigh in there too, given her work on it. What would be a couple of big takeaways if we think about moving toward this as a revenue base for the state?
Yeah, well, if I may, I can answer the first question a little bit and just add that the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning is a regional organization in the northeastern part of the state that is federally and state mandated to think about how we run and fund our transportation system. And our transit system is currently facing a $770 million fiscal cliff that will hit next year in 2026. So back in 2022, we were tasked by the General Assembly to think about how we could fund the system in a more sustainable way. And because our system is funded by the Regional Transportation Authority's sales tax, the sales tax has always been at the E part of the funding picture for transit in our region. And that's, CMAP has always, alongside the other authors of the report, has always kind of advocated for modernizing the sales tax base. As Alaine said, I think our sales tax does not currently tax many services. Most of the ones that are covered are utility services. So I think the number we tax 29 out of over 100 possible services. Peer states like Iowa and Wisconsin tax more than 80 services. And that's kind of always had those services in their tax base for quite some time. So I'm losing track of the question now.
Basically, a couple of the big ideas that are kind of sitting out there that maybe have emerged from this latest focus, the report, that type of thing. We'll get Elaine's take on it too. And share yours.
So I think the main kind of key takeaways is that it's really modernizing the tax. It's not a new tax. Our economy has been shifting for half a century from goods to services, and the spending behavior of consumers is similarly shifting, and we're not taxing that spending. So we're losing revenue and we're kind of leaving it on the floor. Also, our current sales tax is quite regressive because we're not taxing services. Higher income households spend more on services than lower income households, and that spending is exempt from taxation right now. So by making this policy change, we can improve our revenue structure. We can address the structural deficit that Alaine talked about, and we can also make the tax less regressive than it is right now.
Alaine, as you did your work and were thinking about a couple of those takeaways, specifically anything that surprised you in the study itself, or something you didn't expect, or a new learning possibly that emerged from the wealth of research that was done around this in other states?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just what stood out to me, and is kind of reiterating something that Elizabeth mentioned, is the just how narrow Illinois' sales tax base currently is, especially when you broaden that look and you look at other Midwestern states or other high population states. The average amount of services that a state taxes in the United States is 50, and as Elizabeth said, we're at just 29. So we definitely are an outlier when you look at the rest of the country with how our current sales tax base and just what things it's applied to. Elizabeth is exactly right. So sales tax really came about in this country after the Great Depression. Before that, most states got the majority of their revenues from property taxes. So when property tax values went down, so did the property tax revenues. Back in the 1930s, Illinois and most of the other states had a mostly goods-based economy. And, since then it has shifted and we have a mostly service-based economy. So we are leaving the majority of the purchases in the economy in our state untaxed.
Yep. If you think a little next about the administration of a services tax or services added to the sales tax base, I mean, a couple of questions come to mind. Is there a particular problem in the administration of that? I mean, off the top of your head, you might think, well, it seems to be fairly straightforward. On a sales tax for goods, it's rung up at the cash register. But are there some problems with administration, and then that we may not be thinking about? And then kind of related to that, what's a range of services you think about appropriate for taxation? Problems with some opposed to others? I'll let you both divvy that up or answer both questions and see what you all think.
So unsurprisingly, the way that our sales tax is set up is quite complicated. We say the sales tax as if it's a singular thing, but there's actually 4 distinct taxes: the realtor's occupation tax, the realtor's use tax, the service occupation tax, and the service use tax. The occupation tax is not a tax on the good that you're purchasing, but rather the retailer's use of the space to sell goods, and then it gets translated and charged to the goods that you purchase. And the use taxes were added after the fact so that people wouldn't purchase in other states and not pay taxes. But the service occupation tax is kind of a misnomer because it isn't you're not actually being taxed on the service. You're being taxed on the good that is being transferred through the provision of a service. So if you're getting your brakes repaired, you are paying for the parts that were used in that repair, but not for the actual labor that is being performed. And the way that this is all written up in the tax code will make it pretty difficult to implement the service tax. And that's one of the main reasons why every time it comes up, it's often seen as being too challenging to move forward. And that's one of the key things they'll have to figure out is, do you create a whole new separate tax, or do you kind of reform our existing code to make sure that you can tax those services that are being provided? Also, one complication is kind of in line with some recent changes that were made to the sales tax through the Level the Playing Field Act, which made it so that you could tax remote transactions. So when you order things online prior to 2021, if those businesses that you were purchasing from are located outside the state or outside the place that you lived, you probably didn't pay sales taxes on that. And in 2021, you started paying sales taxes on that. But the distinction between a remote seller and a local seller is actually quite complicated. It gets even more complicated when you think about services that are performed in our economy today, which are often kind of across a virtual space. So tracking those transactions will be really challenging.
Maybe particular services that are thrown out there and benefit of some over another, ease of some over another, political aspects.
Definitely, there's going to be some, political aspects of it. I mean, when we look at, again, the other states' tax base across the country in comparison to Illinois' tax base, ours is very narrow right now in that it does not include consumer services. But if we were to expand it to, let's just say, every service out there, just anyone you can think of, then we would probably have an overly wide sales tax base. Right. So a few examples of these would be like business to business transactions, professional services. That would probably be politically difficult. I know a lot of legislators are lawyers, so that would be part of that. Other things such as childcare, housing, healthcare. Adding a tax to that could limit access to those services that are really important for certain folks. And I think that politically, that's kind of a non-starter for a lot of reasons.
Thank you. I want to open it up to the audience for questions. I don't want to give that short shrift, but let's talk a little bit more on the take you both have around the politics of doing this. I mean, particularly, and you may have figured out from lunch discussion, this group particularly is pretty politically active. They talk to their elected representatives. They come out for various purposes, whether it's town halls, office hours, what have you. To build some support for that, as they talk to policymakers and others, what do we need to think about on the political front? I mean, we all understand that, yes, the trial lawyers are going to come out and not be real happy if legal services are taxed, or, the dry cleaners will come out and be upset. But if we're trying to build a case for this, because we do have vested interest in building a revenue base in our state, what are some things you might suggest, some lessons for us, ways to talk to elected officials, that type of thing?
Yeah. One of the main things we were trying to do with the report when we were working with CTBA and also the Civic Federation and the Illinois Economic Policy Institute was do some myth busting around what it would actually mean to expand the base to services. I think part of that is myth busting for the general public, but also for our legislators who, first off, have various beliefs as to why it can be done or why it hasn't been done previously. I think one of the main challenges is it's called the Constitution, or the conformity clause of the Constitution, which states that you can only tax services uniformly. And this in the 60s, the first time they did try to expand the sales tax to services, it was found unconstitutional because they only identified a handful of services And so it was found that it didn't tax all services uniformly. I think because of this, a lot of people believe that taxing services would be unconstitutional. But I think the argument we tried to put forward in the report is that if you tax a broad base of services, you include reasonable exemptions, like some of the ones that Alaine mentioned. And then in the legislation, you state you have clear legislative intent for why you're taxing or why you're doing it, what you're doing, then you can overcome some of those challenges that they've experienced in the past.
Go ahead, Alaine. Thoughts?
Listen.
Just in terms of political advice.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I think going back to what Elizabeth said about the regressivity of the state's current tax system. So right now, Illinois is, I believe, 8th in tax regressivity in the nation, meaning that lower income folks pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes. And that's not just in sales taxes, that's in all other things like property taxes, income tax, et cetera. So I think that while all taxes are inherently regressive, except for 2 taxes, an income tax, as long as it's progressive, meaning those who earn more paying a higher percentage for estate taxes, which is, when, wealth transfer sort of thing. All other taxes are inherently regressive. So a sales tax is inherently regressive, and there's just no getting around that. However, I think that by, the way you control the base, you can have it be less regressive than what it currently is. So an example that I like to give and kind of like helps, explain how that is, for example, a lower or middle income family would go out and buy a lawnmower, and they would pay a sales tax on that lawnmower because it's a tangible good. A higher income family might use a lawn service and pay no taxes on it. So this is kind of just getting back to what Elizabeth said about how, higher income folks are spending more of their income on services, things that are not essentials, typically are services versus goods, where low and middle income families tend to spend more on goods. So I think when we come back to just looking at the progressivity or regressivity of how taxes work in our state, we don't want to be on the top 10 list for tax regressivity in this country. And I think that, speaks very powerfully to folks that might, be looking into, how can we make sure that higher income people are paying their fair share?
Yeah, but if I can just add to that, it takes a moment to turn on. I think something we've seen just in the last few years when we've really been talking about this with legislatures is that they tend to want to know which services they can tax to avoid taxing the things that lower income households rely on, or the businesses that are primarily made up of like small businesses or minority owned businesses. And I think something that we found is that really the best way we can do this, the way that imposes the least negative impacts on people, is to have a broad-based service tax. If you're picking out 4 or 5 services, you're creating distortions in the economy. Most people rely on all things. So if you're getting a haircut, if you are wealthier, you might pay more for your haircut than if you are not. But that doesn't mean that we should exempt haircuts, because if we do, we aren't charging wealthier people for the haircuts that they're getting. So I think one of the main things we can go to the legislature with is keep intentionality as a part of this policy move.
Understood. Let's use this opportunity to open up for questions. We have 2 great experts here, spent a chunk of their working lives over the most recent past becoming experts by doing deep dives in this work, and ready to take on any questions you might have. Nice and loud, please. Yes. Claire, go ahead. All right.
I plan that you mentioned one service there who are talking to a group of people who are very experienced, have years and years and years and years of experience. Good way of saying all without saying it. So a lot of us that can't do, for example, talk in one service, can't do my one service, move along one stuff anywhere. So in some instances, like lawn service, snow removal, things like that, you're actually going after smaller seniors who all have the issue of services that relate to seniors come into this discussion, service tax.
I can't say that we thought about the demographic breakdown in that way. I think similar to what I was just saying, I think having kind of the broadest tax base possible allows you to tax the most services and collect the most revenue possible. One of the other downsides of just picking a few services to tax is that you're kind of, again, leaving the revenue on the floor of everything else you could be taxing. But if you have a broad base, you're raising the most revenue possible. And then if you've read the report, you see that we recommend the state and other local governments use the new revenue in very specific targeted ways to provide tax relief. So one would be providing, like expanding the earned income tax credit or providing rebates to families who are now being taxed more on sales through the sales tax. There's also, you can fund like a circuit breaker programs to provide property tax relief. And then, as I was saying at the beginning, like the funding of critical services is one of the most important things that our government can do with the revenue that it's raising. So funding transit, funding education, funding services that other demographics rely on is really critical. And that's where our state has been struggling because of its deficits.
Going in on that link.
Yeah, I think that was a great answer. I think that, we need to look at this very holistically. So, yes, because of the way that a service expansion would have to work in our state due to the conformity clause in the state constitution, just picking this service or that service, it hasn't worked in the past. It runs afoul of the conformity clause. So, just by just making it clear that we need to apply the broadest base to services, again, with reasonable exceptions. And then, from there, just as Elizabeth said, we could use some of those funds to, create a, tax relief in other ways for folks that need it, as well as provide programs and whatnot for, folks that might need help that, could be paying more due to this expansion.
Can they get fund pension?
Yes.
It was interesting. Clary, you're going to be up in 30 seconds. One of the things I've run into, I was just talking to someone not related to SUAA on this, and there's concern about getting a services tax in place, but then not ever seeing any tax relief, say on property tax or, providing some certain services, just adding more into the bucket with no clear use. And that would be a political lift to get down. Claire, please.
I'm not sure what it's called, but I know effective January 1st this year, I think rent became subject to a tax. I don't know, that's the sales tax surcharge. Do you discuss whatever happens? Was it implemented with the Chicago Metropolitan?
I was not involved in that. Were you involved in the lease tax, Alaine? No. It is, I believe it's an extension of the SUT to leases. Leases were one of the services that we had originally identified in the Plan of Action for Regional Transit that was released in 2023. So I think it's like a very small step in the right direction, but I don't know a ton about how it came to be. I do know it has caused a lot of questions, and it's proving to be really challenging to implement.
Yes. Right behind you. Yes. Mm-hmm.
When Director Warturi made a presentation to our chapter 5 years ago, one of his strongest points was he pointed out that Iowa had taxes about 93 services, Wisconsin 76, other states 20s, and we have 5. Are those dramatic data still the same now?
Since Ralph is Elaine's boss, we're going to let her tack with you.
Yeah, I'll speak to his numbers 5 years ago. So the way that we are analyzing the number of services that a state tax, and I say that in quotes because there's 100 different ways to look at it, because different service categories aren't necessarily black and white. There can be different services that are, under different industries. Different industries can provide many different services. So it can become very quickly as complicated as you want to make it. So right now, Illinois does tax 29 services. However, they, I believe, tax the 5 that are under the authority and at the typical state rate of 6.25%. That is like included as a sales tax. So there are different things that are taxed right now by the state. Like I think Elizabeth mentioned utilities and commercial parking and certain things. I know Chicago has a streaming tax, for example. So there are different taxes that could fall into a service tax currently, but they're done so at different rates and under a different authority. So another probably implementation consideration as we're thinking about expanding the base is just, how would all of that interplay? So, probably what would have to happen is, a lot of the current services that are taxed that would have to be repealed because, we're going to put into this, the current sales tax, this expansion that will then include those services because we don't want to double tax anything and make anything more complicated than it needs to be.
Question.
I hope that answered question.
I don't have an answer to that, but I did want to go back to what you were saying, Randy, before it gets too far from us. I think one of the other issues in Illinois, and Alaine alluded to this, we have very high sales tax rates. When you add up the state rates, the county rates, if you live in a home rule municipality, they will have a sales tax. If you live in the RTA region, you'll also be paying the RTA rates. And then maybe you'll be paying these kind of singular taxes on top of that. And so one of the thoughts is that once the revenue comes in, local governments or the state government can think about, like, do we really need to be charging the same tax rates? Because one of the benefits of expanding the base is that you are now taxing more things and raising more revenue. And so maybe you don't need to be charging the same rate that you are. Of course, we do have a structural deficit and we do have many things that are being underfunded. So it would need to be a delicate conversation. But there is always this option of potentially lowering rates that could be considered.
Yes. Sure.
I want to relate the tax and education. If I am a teacher for my grandson, you have a teacher. Do you think you are the add taxes here? Is it serious today? The service means
Piano teachers.
it
Private lessons.
for my kid. So what would you want to charge me through that? So
Potentially.
we expanded the quantitative university, and that's the taxes that you actually share out the every single board. I think is it the tax supposed to add them?
I can start and then I think the report names, and Alaine said these earlier, that housing, healthcare, and childcare are things that the legislature should consider not taxing. These are services that are really related to kind of quality of life and that you can't escape paying those things. One of our colleagues who was working with us kind of cautioned us that you start a slippery slope when you start naming things. And one of the next things on the list would be education. I think most folks would agree that you should not be taxing education. And similarly, it's important to quality of life.
Yeah, I would have said pretty much the exact same thing. I think that, the way that the uniformity clause is written is there can be, like, quote, reasonable
Exceptions.
reasonable exemptions. So, I think that we can make an argument for that, this is reasonable, like for the business to business service exemption that we are proposing. It's reasonable because other states do not tax these services. So, I think this is just where it gets into, the nitty gritty of implementation, like what does it make sense to exclude? And is there a reasonable argument that can be made for that?
Plus, that piano teacher's lobby is strong. We don't want to get them upset. Let's go ahead.
Yes.
On these arguments.
Yeah, so CMAP recently did some modeling, and we estimated that in the second year of implementation, you could raise $2.7 billion across the state. So that would be $2 billion going to the state, about $315 million going to the Regional Transportation Authority, and then the remainder going to the various counties and local governments that have their own sales taxes. That was only in the second year of implementation, still assumes that there's some lack of compliance. So that number goes up significantly in the third year and then beyond.
Thank you, Alaine, on.
Okay. All right. Other questions? Yes.
I understand the crop of the deficit and with RTA, and I understand the consequences of those. But what are the consequences of Illinois is already giving at the very highly tax, especially by seniors, topping the screw obviously. But how do you fight that? As are you going to lose more citizenry? Rather you keep adding that.
Yeah, I think that is a really important thing to bring up because you're absolutely right. Illinois is viewed as a high tax state. Definitely, it's a high property tax state because historically we have relied on property taxes as the primary source of K-12 education funding. We were pretty much 50th out of 50 in reliance on property taxes for our public schools, which is not a great place to be in because there's a lot of equity issues with that. If you live in a place that has high property values, your school will be very well funded. If you live in a place with not so high property values, your school could be very not well funded. So, there's a lot of different facets that come into play when it comes to this sort of thing. So yes, we, are viewed as a high tax state, but again, just kind of going back to, we have this extremely narrow base and Iowa tax it is 89 service categories right now. Wisconsin also in the 80s. So it's, would folks necessarily leave Illinois because we are, changing our sales tax base to reflect our Midwest neighbors? I don't know that they would. So I think as Elizabeth mentioned, there is a potential to lower the rate when you expand the base. I mean, I think that has a lot of other issues too. A lot of the problems with, the budget at the state level aren't from high spending. It's from, let's call it fiscal mismanagement. A lot of it coming from the pensions. We pay a lot of pension debt, almost, triple the amount of what the actual normal cost for the pensions, the benefits that state employees have earned. So I think that, just looking at everything holistically, these are all the things we need to consider.
So I thought a little too.
Yeah, I'll say kind of as I was saying before, the high rates that people pay, it's not because of any particular actor. It's because of the adding up of various rates being charged by various governments. And part of that is because of all of these issues at the state. Support for local governments has declined over time, while local government costs have grown over time, and they have no other way to fund those things other than not provide services or rely on the tools that they have, which is the property tax and the sales tax. So by expanding the base, by ensuring that you have more revenue, you can provide the services and you can keep up to the change in costs over time.
I think we're going to get to Bob in a second. I want to take a little twist on that question, though. So set aside someone just saying, I've had enough of the high taxes in Illinois, I'm moving somewhere else. I actually reside in a location where within 90 minutes drive or less, I can get to Missouri, Kentucky, and Indiana. Many people here can get to Wisconsin. If you're Blackhawk College, you go across to Iowa. Do we have to worry about exporting a services tax out? I mean, it's one thing. In fact, Kent probably remembers this. A number of years ago, I think we had a farm implement bill to change the tax on that so farmers wouldn't go buy a $100,000 or now a $500,000 combine in Indiana. So is that much problem with services, though? I can see with goods. I'll go buy my car somewhere else, but Is it really come into play on services very much, do you think?
It's really hard to know if you don't have the tax because you can't, there's no way to track how people are behaving in relationship to it. I think Alaine mentioned this earlier. A lot of the border states that Illinois does border do tax services. And so in some ways, by expanding our own base, we would really just be matching and like coming up to where they already are. And so there would be less of an escape in the way that there might be on the goods side. There's also, I think, part of the reason why we really want to make sure that business-to-business transactions aren't included in the service tax is because they aren't included in the service tax elsewhere. So the main folks who might move their behavior would be these businesses. But if they can get an exemption in other places, they can also get that exemption here. And that's how we ensure that we stay economically competitive.
Late, what I think, Lane.
And yeah, I would just kind of like add it the other way. So, Illinois doesn't tax, the majority of consumer services, but I don't think we see, buses full of people coming from Wisconsin to get their hair cut here, so Elizabeth is right. We don't have the tax. We don't have the data yet, but I would argue most likely no.
Now, please be reminded that Bob Fleiter is no longer a member of the Illinois General Assembly. So do not corner him or point your finger at him because we can't blame him for anything now. But we're glad to have you with us, Bob. Please.
Thank you for that.
For protecting you.
So I have to kind of ask a little bit of a political question. Can you envision a scenario where something service taxes would go to local governments and then in exchange create the opportunity to lower property tax?
Yeah, I think that's one of the main recommendations in the report. One of the last times that there was a proposal for a service tax, it was structured as unique excise taxes on, I think, 5 different services, but only at the state level. And that created some complications in terms of like administering the tax and then getting it through the constitutionality test. So it kind of died on the arrival. But I think one of the main things we want to make sure is that any expansion of the basics is not only for the state, but also for local governments so that they're benefiting from this change in the same way.
Okay, then. All right.
Other questions? Yes, go ahead, Kat. We were waiting for you.
Just what? That probably was. So part of this is going to be, you're hoping to control the narrative if you're rolling this out. Some of it you might not be able to control. But let's assume for a minute that we're not going to have a massive worldwide recession where we've got no revenue, we got a full-arm fire, we're not willing to go back to the income tax, and that's our only option is to try and get enough sales tax revenue to keep basic services afloat. But let's assume that's not going to happen. And then, are you being too much I hate to use the word timid, should you be bolder in terms of the fact that, we're going to generate $2 billion? Okay, that's, this is, it's not an aesthetic in terms of, we really good in terms of public finance, best thinking to have something that's less regressive or more balanced or something like that. If you're going to sell this, you need a grand market. You need to have a big chunk of change that you can talk about serious property tax ruling. Here's what we generate a big ton of money, and we're going to rework the property claim. If you're going to sell this, then not just on aesthetics or kind of working on the margins, but, should you be going for grand market? That was the deal back when we were trying to do property tax for sales tax with Governor Edgar, and it got, we all got okayed to the Senate, but we're talking about some serious reduction in property tax with a serious increase in sales tax at the time. So you need to be bold.
and I'm letting them formulate their answer. And I'm guessing they're going to be somewhat timid themselves and stepping too far out to make political judgments.
But go ahead.
And the point, you raised is what I thought. This is going to be a heavy lift. If this eventually happens, whatever the suite of services is, this is a heavy lift. We're going to get one bite at the apple. We need to be bold in that case and take it on. But is there going to have to be a big bargain to get that accomplished? So I know you all talk to a lot of folks. You're probably hesitant stepping out too far in your roles with your agencies, but you're on tape, but we're going to show it to anybody. So go ahead.
Yeah, and I think I'm realizing now I didn't answer the property tax part of the first question. I think it's one of the things we talk about when we're thinking about tax policy at CMAP is how interrelated all of these different systems are. It makes it hard to compare Illinois to other places because each state has its own mixture of income tax, property tax, sales tax, other tax, and they're structured differently and they're charged at different rates. But we do know, as Alaine said, that a lot of our local property tax rates are very high because of the pressures and the things that need to be funded at the level. In the northwestern or northeastern Illinois region, we have municipalities with property tax rates that exceed 40%. And they have no other way to pay for services because they have been historically disinvested communities. They don't have strong commercial tax bases that allow them to even rely on a service tax on goods. So I think property tax reform should be a part of the conversation, but it'll just be up to the legislature how far that goes.
Feeling?
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary, just looking at how all of these different taxes interplay. I think that kind of going back to what I said in the introduction, we have a pretty serious structural deficit at the state level. Our costs grow much quicker than our revenues have in the past, 25 years or what have you. And in that same time, though, if you look at fiscal year 2000, the state is paying about 10% less on core services, things like K-12 education, higher education, healthcare, public safety, et cetera, than we are now. So that means that, when we account for inflation, we're actually spending less on those very critical services than we were 25 years ago. So I think that the sales tax expansion is one part of the major overhaul that probably has to happen to get our costs and our revenue more in line. So there's, a lot of other parts to that we don't want to, get too off topic. I know pensions are a huge one. Our unfunded pension liabilities are costing the state, billions of dollars. And there are things that could be done to fix that. So, I think that, yes, property taxes being high for low to middle income folks are a problem. And, that should definitely be part of this solution too. I think definitely politically that would help. But there's just also a lot of, much larger things at play as well. And the sales tax is actually probably only part of what really needs to be done to solve this problem.
Yeah, I can add, I think there's a line in the report that says sales tax modernization will solve a lot of issues, but not all of the issues.
I think, Ken, in the elegant language of policy analysts, they're saying there's going to have to be a deal. We're going to get a couple more questions. Go ahead, and then we'll finish, Keith, with you. Yes, please.
So one of the things I did before the position I have now at UAC was I'm a nutrition educator. So the one thing that always comes to mind is how much we pay in healthcare because of what people in some communities are really forced to eat because they live with food deserts. So I'm thinking about a lot of the fast food establishments all over the state. So they make a huge profit, but then that profit also caused by these other additional costs through Medicaid, WIC, and so forth, and just healthcare as a whole. I think that really should be taken into account because that's a huge amount of money and in people's lives of living a short life and having all these different chronic diseases So I think that if we don't address that, we may be addressing this over here. But with healthcare here, it's really expensive and are living as long as they should because of what they eat. But the fast food establishments are really still making a lot of money over what people need to eat sometimes. So they live in real soda tax.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can comment on that a little bit. So I think, yes, you're absolutely right. There are probably, if we were to sit and think of ideas, probably many ways that costs could be cut in a way that is healthy for the state, healthy for residents, individuals, healthy for the economy, all of that. So I don't know any estimates on, just what could be saved by the state in healthcare costs if we were to initiate policies like the ones you brought up. But, I think that's a great idea. And I just, know that, looking at, sheer dollar amounts, right? Things such as sales tax expansion, fixing the unfunded pension liability. There's probably another one that I can't think of, but just, no shortage of good ideas. I know this year in FY26, a lot of tax expenditures, corporate loopholes were closed. I think when, to start to come up with ideas that, increase our revenue, possibly decrease our costs, I think they should be on the table.
Yeah, I think earlier Kent asked me why an organization like CMAP is working on the sales tax. And I think as a transportation agency, we that is also tasked to think about the economy and land use and housing. I think we have the benefit of thinking of how these issues are interrelated with one another and how a community that is struggling to get a grocery store is also the community that has a high property tax rate and that where people have low property values, and it's all related. And so I think we can pull one string and then hopefully move on to the next one.
And then there becomes a whole other issue about how tax policy can be used to shape behavior and what happens as a result of that, political difficulty in doing it. But those types of things are interesting discussions. Some of us remember SOTI tax discussions and things of that from previously in Illinois and how that went. But Keith, you get the honor of the last question, sir.
Thank you. So talked a lot about the service tax, right? And part of it, right? This part of the potential fix. Even this past legislative session, there was a resolution introduced encouraging no new tax to retirement. Can you speak to and in conversation discussions that relate to possibly tax and retirement income? That our awareness?
Give your 2 cents. It's okay.
Yeah.
Just be careful. Remember the correct knots.
Great.
Non-tease.
That's right.
I think that taxing retirement income is just that, it's income. And certain folks have more of it than others. I think that, as we are thinking about the fiscal difficulties that the state is facing, as well as, thinking about issues like equality and regressivity, should we tax it? I don't know. But, I think that, there could be a question of equality there. I know a lot of folks that maybe have less retirement income. Maybe that wouldn't make a lot of sense to do at this point when we think about, just that regressivity issue that we already have a lot of in the state.
I'll admit, I don't know very much about how retirement income is taxed in Illinois. My mom lives in Washington State, so I can tell you more about it there. But I think one of the things that CMAP thinks about and is kind of statutorily required to think about is the socioeconomic forecast and the trends of where a region is today compared to where it will be in the next 20, 40, 50 years. And we know that the population as a whole is getting older, and that as a result of that, the working population will be getting smaller. And so we will probably have to, I think critically about how we tax different forms of income and different segments of the population moving forward.
This may be experience you all have going to family reunions, your local watering hole, and people know we have a public pension. And the discussion comes up often about the fact that retired pension is not taxed and income. And And what you hear discussion about is potentially would there be some threshold at which it starts? And I think that's, again, I'm editorializing, I apologize, but I think that's a legitimate public policy discussion that we probably need to have generally in Illinois, and we'll see where it goes. I'm sure SUAA would be ready to take a position on that if something emerged, but politically that's that's right. Politically, that's another one of those really tough lifts because all of us in my age category vote. So that's something to bear in mind. Please join me in giving a round of SUAA thanks to the two E's, Elizabeth and Alaine.